saying a single word back to her. The next morning, there was a police car parked outside her house. My name is Frank Coleman. I am 68 years old. Before I tell you what happened that morning, you need to hear how we got there, because none of this happened by accident. If you like real stories about family, loyalty, and people who get exactly what they deserve, stay until the end, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe. Now let me tell you everything, from the beginning. I bought my house on Birchwood Lane in Cleveland, Ohio back in 1988. I was 29 years old, working double shifts at the post office, and my wife Diane was pregnant with our only son, Daniel. We didn't have much money, but we had that house, and to us, it was everything. Diane picked out the kitchen tiles herself. I built the back porch with my own hands over 3 summers. We raised Daniel in that house, watched him grow up, watched him leave for college, and watched him come back home with a job and a good heart. Diane passed away 4 years ago from cancer. It was just me in that house after that, full of quiet rooms and old memories. Daniel worried about me living alone, and I understood why. So when he told me he wanted to move in with his new wife Vanessa to help take care of me, I was grateful. I thought it was love. I thought my son was doing the right thing by his old man. I didn't know then that Vanessa had her own plans for that house, and that my son moving back in was only the beginning of something much bigger than either of us understood at the time. Looking back now, I can see the signs were there from the very first week she moved in, but a grieving old man doesn't always see clearly, and I wanted so badly to believe my son had found happiness. I welcomed her with open arms. I gave her a key to the front door. I never once thought that key would become a weapon. Vanessa was 33 years old when she married my son. She was polite in front of people, always smiling at church, always saying the right things at family dinners. But behind closed doors, she was a different woman entirely. Within the first 6 months of living in my house, she had already rearranged my living room, replaced my wife's curtains without asking me, and told Daniel that the guest room where I kept Diane's old sewing machine needed to become her home office. I let it go every time. It was easier to let it go than to fight about it. Daniel worked long hours as an insurance adjuster downtown, and every night he came home tired, caught between his wife's demands and his father's quiet patience. I watched my son shrink a little more every month. He used to laugh loud and often. Now he mostly just nodded along with whatever Vanessa said at the dinner table. I never said anything bad about her to him, not once, because I could see he was already carrying enough weight. But I noticed things. I noticed how she talked about the house like it already belonged to her. I noticed how she asked Daniel more than once why the deed was still only in my name. I noticed how she watched me sometimes, like she was doing math in her head. I told myself I was being an overly suspicious old man. I told myself my son was happy, and that was enough. I was wrong to stay quiet for as long as I did, but I loved my son more than I trusted my instincts, and back then, that felt like the right choice to make. About 4 months before everything changed, Daniel came to me alone on a Saturday morning while Vanessa was out getting her hair done. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, the same table where he used to do his homework as a boy, and he looked nervous in a way I hadn't seen since he was a teenager. He handed me a thick manila folder and told me to keep it somewhere safe, somewhere Vanessa would never think to look. I asked him what it was. He said, "Dad, just trust me on this one. If anything ever happens to me, open this folder first, before you do anything else." I remember laughing a little, telling him he was being dramatic, that nothing was going to happen to a healthy 36-year-old man. He didn't laugh back. He just looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before, something between fear and determination. I took the folder without opening it and locked it in the old fireproof box in my closet, the same box where Diane used to keep our marriage certificate and Daniel's birth certificate. I didn't ask more questions that day, because Daniel looked like a man who had already made up his mind about something serious, and I trusted him completely. Now, looking back, I wonder how much he already knew about what was coming. I wonder how long he had been quietly protecting me without ever saying the words out loud. That folder sat untouched in my closet for 4 months, and I had no idea it would end up saving everything I had left. It was a Tuesday evening in October when I got the phone call that changed my life forever. Daniel had been driving home from work on Interstate 90 when another driver ran a red light and hit his car on the driver's side. The paramedics said he passed away before he even reached the hospital. I remember standing in my kitchen holding the phone, unable to speak, unable to breathe properly. Vanessa was standing right next to me when the call came in, and I remember her face going pale, her hands shaking as she grabbed the phone from me to hear the details herself. For a moment, just a brief moment, I saw real grief on her face, and it made me feel less alone in the house that night. The days that followed are still a blur to me. Phone calls to the funeral home, choosing a casket, calling relatives in 3 different states. Vanessa handled most of the arrangements, and at the time I was thankful, because I could barely function enough to get dressed in the morning. I kept expecting to hear Daniel's truck pull into the driveway. I kept setting 3 plates at dinner out of habit before catching myself. Losing a wife had been hard. Losing my only son felt like losing the last piece of the life Diane and I had built together. I sat in his old bedroom one night, the same room he had as a boy, and I cried until I had nothing left. I had no idea that in less than a week, the woman helping me plan my son's funeral would stand in that same house and tell me to get out. The funeral was held on a cold Saturday morning at a church 3 blocks from our house, the same church where Daniel had been baptized 36 years earlier. More than 100 people came. Co-workers from his office, old friends from high school, neighbors who had known him his whole life. I stood at the front next to the casket, shaking hands and accepting hugs from people I hadn't seen in years. Vanessa stood beside me the entire service, dressed in black, playing the part of the grieving widow perfectly. After the burial, everyone came back to the house for the reception, the same tradition we had done when Diane passed. I was sitting in the living room, in my own armchair, still in my funeral suit, when Vanessa approached me with a plate of food she didn't offer me. The room was full of people, maybe 20 or 30 of them, standing around with paper plates and quiet conversation. She leaned down close to my ear and said, in a voice just loud enough for the people nearby to hear, "Stop crying. Pack your bags and get out now. This is my house. You have 30 days." The room went completely silent. I saw Walter Briggs, my neighbor of 30 years, freeze mid-sentence with a cup of coffee in his hand. I saw Daniel's old coworker, a woman named Patricia, cover her mouth in shock. Every single person in that living room heard what she said, on the day we buried my son, in the house I had built with my own hands 40 years earlier. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue with her in front of all those people. I looked at Vanessa for a long moment, and something inside me went completely still and quiet, the way water goes still right before it freezes. I thought about Daniel, about the folder sitting in my closet, about the 4 months I had spent trusting my son without asking questions. I thought about 40 years of memories in that house, about Diane's kitchen tiles and the porch I built with my own hands. Then I smiled at Vanessa, a real, calm smile, and I said, "All right." That's all I said, one word. The room stayed silent for a few more seconds before people slowly went back to their quiet conversations, unsure of what they had just witnessed. I stood up from my armchair, walked upstairs to my bedroom, and packed 1 bag. I didn't need much. A few changes of clothes, my medication, a photo of Diane and Daniel from a Christmas years ago, and the fireproof box from my closet with Daniel's folder still locked inside it. I came back downstairs 20 minutes later, bag in one hand, box tucked under my other arm, and walked straight past Vanessa toward the front door. She looked almost disappointed that I wasn't fighting her on it, like she had been expecting tears or begging. I gave her nothing. I opened the front door, stepped out into the cold October air, and walked 2 houses down the street without looking back once. Behind me, I could still hear the low murmur of confused guests inside my own house, wondering what they had just watched happen to an old man on the worst day of his life. Walter Briggs had been my neighbor for 30 years, ever since he and his wife moved in 2 doors down back in the 90s. He was 70 years old now, a retired auto mechanic, the kind of man who still fixed his own gutters and mowed his own lawn every Saturday morning. He had been at Daniel's funeral that day, and he had heard exactly what Vanessa said in that living room. When he opened his front door and saw me standing on his porch with a bag in one hand and a metal box under my arm, he didn't ask a single question. He just stepped aside and said, "Get in here, Frank, it's cold." His wife Carol made up the guest bedroom for me that same night without being asked twice. I sat at their kitchen table, and Walter poured 2 cups of coffee, sliding one across to me before sitting down across from me. "You want to talk about it?" he asked. I told him everything. The 30-day deadline, the way she said it in front of everyone, the way she looked almost happy delivering that news to a man who had just buried his only son. Walter shook his head slowly, his jaw tight with anger on my behalf. "That house is yours, Frank," he said. "Deed's in your name. Has been since before Daniel was even born. She's got no legal right to put you out of anywhere." I nodded, but my mind wasn't fully on the legal details yet. My mind was on that folder, still locked in the box beside my chair, the one Daniel had told me to open first if anything ever happened to him. That night, after Walter and Carol had gone to bed, I sat alone at their kitchen table under a small lamp, and I finally opened it. Inside the folder were 3 things that changed everything. The first was a copy of the deed to my own house, confirming what Walter had already told me, that the house had always been in my name alone, never transferred to Daniel or Vanessa in any way. The second was a life insurance policy, one Daniel had taken out through his job 2 years earlier, worth $500,000. 3 months before he died, Daniel had quietly changed the beneficiary on that policy from Vanessa to me. The third item was a handwritten letter in Daniel's own handwriting. In it, he explained that he had discovered Vanessa was secretly draining their joint savings account and had run up over $60,000 in hidden credit card debt she never told him about. He wrote that he suspected she was planning to push me out of the house eventually so she could sell it, and that he had been quietly preparing to file for divorce once he had enough proof gathered. He asked me to forgive him for not telling me sooner, and he asked me to protect myself no matter what happened, no matter how things looked on the surface. I sat at that kitchen table and read the letter 3 times, tears running down my face, not just from grief now, but from something else too, a kind of clarity settling into my chest. My son had seen this coming. My son had spent his last months quietly protecting his father from a woman who had already decided our family's grief was nothing more than an opportunity. I folded the letter carefully, placed everything back in the box, and for the first time since the funeral, I did not feel powerless anymore. The next morning, while I was still at Walter's house eating breakfast, Vanessa was already moving fast back at my house. A neighbor across the street, an older woman named Ruth, who had lived on Birchwood Lane even longer than I had, called Walter's phone around 9 in the morning to tell him she had seen a moving truck and a real estate agent's car parked in my driveway. The agent, a woman named Denise Marsh, had put a small sign near the mailbox that read, "Coming soon," with a photo of the house on it. Vanessa was moving to sell my house less than 24 hours after burying her husband, and less than a day after telling me to leave. What she didn't know was that Daniel's letter had told me exactly where to look and what to look for. That same morning, I called Arthur Kessler, an old family friend who had been a real estate attorney in Cleveland for over 30 years. He had helped Diane and me with our own house paperwork decades earlier, and he had known Daniel since he was a boy. I told Arthur everything, the funeral, the 30-day deadline, the folder, the moving truck already showing up. Arthur told me to sit tight, and within 2 hours he called back with news that made my stomach drop. He had pulled the county recorder's records that morning, and there was a quitclaim deed filed just 3 days earlier, supposedly signed by Daniel, transferring full ownership of my house from me to Vanessa. The problem was, according to the notary stamp on that document, it had been signed and notarized on a day when Daniel was actually 400 miles away at a work conference in Chicago. Arthur Kessler did not waste any time once he found that document. He had been practicing law long enough to know exactly what he was looking at, a forged deed, backdated and notarized under false pretenses to make it look legitimate. He pulled the notary's license information listed on the document and discovered the notary herself, a woman named Sharon Kellerman, had no record of ever notarizing anything for Daniel Coleman on that date, or any date. Arthur suspected, and later confirmed, that Vanessa had paid Sharon, a former co-worker of hers from years earlier, to forge the notary stamp and backdate the paperwork using an old, unused notary seal Sharon still had access to. Arthur explained to me that this wasn't just a family dispute anymore. This was deed fraud and forgery, both serious felony crimes under Ohio law, and both crimes that carried real prison time. He asked me one simple question before doing anything further. "Frank, do you want to handle this quietly, or do you want to report it?" I thought about Daniel, about the letter in his own handwriting, about how hard my son had worked in his final months to protect a father he loved. I thought about Vanessa standing in my living room the day of his funeral, telling a grieving old man to pack his bags in front of 30 people. I looked at Arthur and said, "Report it, all of it." Arthur filed a formal complaint with the Cuyahoga County Recorder's Fraud Division that same afternoon, along with copies of the forged deed, the notary's false statement, and Daniel's original letter as supporting evidence. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, the case had already been forwarded to the Cleveland Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit. The detective assigned to the case was a woman named Detective Maria Ruiz, a 20-year veteran of the Cleveland Police Department who specialized in fraud and forgery cases. Arthur met with her personally that same evening and walked her through everything: the timeline of Daniel's death, the funeral, the 30-day eviction demand made in front of dozens of witnesses, and the forged deed filed just days before Daniel even passed away. Detective Ruiz pulled additional records that night, including Daniel's actual work travel records from his insurance company, confirming he had truly been in Chicago on the date the deed claimed he signed it in Cleveland. She also reached out to the real estate agent, Denise Marsh, who had no idea the property she was preparing to list had a fraudulent ownership claim attached to it. Denise, wanting nothing to do with a fraud investigation, immediately pulled the "coming soon" sign from my yard and canceled the listing paperwork. Detective Ruiz told Arthur that with the notary's forged stamp, the impossible travel timeline, and Daniel's handwritten letter all lining up together, she had more than enough for a warrant. She also mentioned that Vanessa had attempted to file an early claim with Daniel's life insurance company that same week, listing herself as the beneficiary, not realizing the policy had already been legally changed 3 months earlier. That attempt alone raised additional red flags with the insurance company's fraud department, who had already begun their own internal review before the police even got involved. Everything Vanessa had rushed to do in the days after burying her husband was now working directly against her, one piece of evidence at a time, exactly the way Daniel had quietly planned for it to happen if she ever tried something like this. The next morning, exactly as Detective Ruiz had planned, a Cleveland police cruiser pulled into the driveway of my house on Birchwood Lane at 7:40 in the morning. Ruth, the neighbor across the street, told Walter later that Vanessa answered the door still in her bathrobe, confused and half asleep. Detective Ruiz identified herself and informed Vanessa she was investigating a filed complaint of deed fraud and forgery related to the property, and that she had several questions regarding the notarized document filed with the county recorder's office. According to Ruth, Vanessa's face went white as a sheet standing in that doorway. She tried explaining that Daniel had signed the paperwork before he passed, but Detective Ruiz calmly informed her that Daniel had been in Chicago on the date in question, a fact confirmed by his own employer's travel records. Vanessa was brought in for formal questioning that same day, along with Sharon Kellerman, the notary who had forged the stamp. Within a week, both women were formally charged, Vanessa with deed fraud, forgery, and attempted insurance fraud, and Sharon with forgery and notary misconduct. The forged deed was voided immediately by the county recorder once the fraud was confirmed, restoring full and clear ownership of the house back to my name, exactly where it had always legally belonged. Vanessa was given 10 days to vacate the property while the criminal case moved forward, the same house she had given me only 30 days to leave less than 2 weeks earlier. Walter told me later that when the moving truck finally came for her, only one neighbor came out to help her carry boxes, and it wasn't out of kindness. It was Ruth, making sure Vanessa didn't try to take anything that didn't belong to her. I moved back into my house on Birchwood Lane on a quiet Thursday afternoon in November, almost exactly 1 month after I'd walked out with one bag and a metal box under my arm. Walter and Carol helped me carry a few boxes back in, and Ruth brought over a casserole that evening, the same kind of small, quiet kindness this street had always been known for. The house felt different without Daniel in it, and it always will, but it also felt like mine again, fully and completely, the way it was supposed to feel. I found Diane's old sewing machine still packed away in a hallway closet, where Vanessa had shoved it years earlier, and I set it back up in the guest room where it belonged. Vanessa eventually took a plea deal on the fraud charges, avoiding the maximum sentence but still receiving probation, a permanent record, and a court order to repay legal fees related to the false property claim. She never contacted me again, not once, and I never reached out to her either. Some nights I still sit in my armchair in the living room, the same chair I was sitting in the day she told me to pack my bags in front of 30 grieving guests, and I think about my son. I think about how, even in his final months, even while carrying his own quiet fears, Daniel found a way to protect his father one last time. That folder in my closet wasn't just paperwork. It was my son's final act of love for me, delivered months before he even knew it would be needed. I lost my son, and nothing will ever replace that. But I got to keep the house we built our family in, and more importantly, I got to keep the truth of who my son really was, right until the very end. If this story moved you, do me a favor and hit that like button, and subscribe for more real stories like this one. I'll see you in the next video.